The United States does not make demands like this quietly. When Washington moves, it moves with weight. And this time, the weight landed directly on Bola Ahmed Tinubu. For months, Abuja had kept the Nnamdi Kanu situation buried behind courtroom doors, security briefings, and carefully managed silence. Every question was deflected. Every international inquiry was met with vague assurances about ongoing legal processes. The strategy was simple: delay, obscure, and wait for the world to move on. It had worked before. Nigerian governments had survived international scrutiny by outlasting it. But this time was different. The United States did not send a polite diplomatic note. They did not raise concerns through back channels and then go quiet. They made a public, formal demand: the release of 2 political prisoners. And one of those names was Nnamdi Kanu, the man Nigeria had secretly renditioned from Kenya, held without credible trial, and kept locked away while his supporters raged and the world slowly took notice. The moment that demand became official, Tinubu's strategy collapsed. You cannot hide behind judicial process language when the most powerful government on earth has just called your bluff in front of the entire world. You cannot claim to respect the rule of law when Washington is holding documented evidence of everything your government has done to circumvent it. Tinubu had to speak. The silence was no longer available to him, and what he said and how he said it changed the entire political calculation. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. For months, Tinubu's government operated on one assumption: that international pressure on the Kanu case would eventually fade. Previous Nigerian administrations had weathered similar storms. Make enough noise about sovereignty, remind the world about security threats, speak loudly about judicial independence, then wait. The headlines move on, the pressure eases, and the prisoner stays exactly where you put him. That calculation made sense on paper. It had worked before. But Tinubu made a serious miscalculation. He did not account for how much attention Kanu's case had accumulated globally over years of fighting. He did not account for the legal teams that had spent years building an international record of violations. The illegal rendition from Nairobi, the compromised trial, the delayed hearings, the denied access. He did not account for diaspora movements across the United Kingdom, the United States, and Europe that had been pushing this case into corridors of power for years without stopping. And he did not account for the fact that Washington was watching something beyond just Kanu. They were watching Nigeria's entire human rights posture. They were evaluating whether Africa's largest economy and most populous nation could be treated as a reliable democratic partner, or whether it was sliding back into the authoritarian habits that had defined so much of its history. When the State Department made its demand public, they were not just asking about Kanu. They were sending a message to Abuja about what kind of government Tinubu was running. And that message landed like a verdict. Inside the presidential villa, panic replaced the calm that had been carefully maintained. Advisors scrambled. Talking points were drafted and then rewritten. Ministers who had previously dismissed international concern as manageable were now arguing behind closed doors about what to do next. The question was no longer whether to respond. The question was how to respond without destroying either the relationship with Washington or the loyalty of hardliners who saw any concession as surrender. That is where the real problem began. Tinubu's security establishment was not willing to recommend release. They had argued consistently that Kanu's detention was a national security matter, that releasing him would embolden the indigenous people of Biafra movement, that it would be interpreted as weakness, that the Southeast would become ungovernable. These arguments had held the line internally for years. They had justified every delay, every procedural maneuver, every month that passed without meaningful legal progress. But America had done its own assessment, and it said something that directly contradicted everything Tinubu's security team was telling him. U.S. intelligence and diplomatic analysis concluded that Kanu's continued detention was not stabilizing the Southeast, it was radicalizing it. Every month he remained imprisoned without fair process. More young people in that region lost faith in federal authority. More families turned against the Nigerian state. More voices that had previously sought peaceful resolution hardened into something angrier and more dangerous. The argument that detention was a security solution was not just morally wrong. According to Washington's own analysis, it was strategically wrong. And now that analysis was on the table in a formal bilateral setting with consequences attached. The State Department was precise about what would happen if Nigeria did not respond substantively. Diplomatic cooperation, trade programs, military support, intelligence sharing, investment facilitation, all of it was now contingent on measurable human rights improvements. This was not a threat delivered in private and then forgotten. It was policy, stated publicly, documented formally, and impossible to walk back. Tinubu felt the heat, and the country felt him feeling it. When he finally spoke publicly on Kanu, the statement his team released was supposed to calm the storm. Instead, it made everything worse. He framed the issue as a judicial matter. He said the executive branch could not interfere with ongoing legal proceedings. He spoke about respecting Nigerian law and protecting national security. He presented himself as a leader who took the rule of law seriously and could not simply release prisoners because of external pressure. The response from international observers was immediate and brutal. Legal analysts pointed out that Tinubu's government had interfered in judicial proceedings repeatedly when it served political interests. Charges against allies disappeared. Cases against critics accelerated under suspicious circumstances. The courts had been instruments of political will for decades, and everyone knew it. The "we cannot interfere" argument was not just weak. It was insulting to anyone who had paid attention to how Nigerian justice actually functioned. Human rights organizations went further. They reminded the global audience that Kanu had been illegally renditioned from Kenya in 2021. He had not surrendered. He had not been extradited through proper legal channels. He had been forcibly removed from a foreign country and brought to Nigeria in secret. That act alone violated international law. And now the government responsible for that violation was claiming to be a defender of legal process. The contradiction was total, and it landed badly everywhere that mattered. Washington's response came within hours. Deep disappointment. That was the official language. But the implications went much further than diplomatic phrasing. The State Department announced a formal review of all bilateral programs. Future cooperation would depend on concrete action, not statements. They were not interested in explanations. They wanted results. That response created a new problem for Tinubu that his original statement had not anticipated. Now European partners began coordinating. The European Union issued its own statement calling for transparent judicial processes and respect for international human rights standards. The United Kingdom summoned the Nigerian High Commissioner. Countries that had been watching from a distance began aligning with Washington's position because the evidence made neutrality difficult to defend. What had started as pressure from one powerful nation became coordinated international isolation, and the economy began to react. This is where the situation escalated beyond politics and into something that threatened the core of Tinubu's presidency. Foreign investors who had already been cautious about Nigeria's instability started pulling back. Two major infrastructure projects worth billions were postponed. The Nigerian stock exchange dropped sharply. The naira weakened further against major currencies as uncertainty spread through financial markets. The finance ministry began receiving alarming projections about capital flight and debt servicing costs if the diplomatic isolation continued. The World Bank delayed a crucial loan approval. The IMF issued governance warnings. Business leaders who had previously supported Tinubu's economic agenda started applying private pressure, warning that the reputational damage from the Kanu crisis was undermining everything else his government was trying to achieve. You cannot attract investment when the international headlines about your country are about political prisoners and state repression. Even within the military establishment, voices began shifting. Defense cooperation with Western allies was a priority for Nigeria's security apparatus. Intelligence sharing, equipment procurement, training programs, all of it depended on maintaining functional relationships with the United States and Europe. The hardliners who had argued most aggressively for keeping Kanu detained were now being told that their position was costing Nigeria its most important defense relationships. That changed some calculations, but the pressure did not stop there. Protests erupted across southeastern Nigeria. Demonstrators demanded Kanu's release, holding signs that framed Tinubu's statement as proof of continued federal marginalization. Security forces responded with crackdowns, arrests, tear gas, heavy-handed dispersal of crowds that international observers and journalists were watching closely. Every act of suppression generated new documentation, new evidence added to the growing file of abuses that Washington and European partners were monitoring. The crackdown was supposed to restore order. Instead, it generated more international attention and more material for the legal cases being built against Nigeria in continental and international forums. International lawyers filed petitions with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, documenting multiple violations of continental treaties. The illegal rendition, the prolonged detention without fair trial, the compromised proceedings, the conditions of detention, these filings were not symbolic. they activated formal accountability mechanisms that could result in censure and sanctions from African institutions. Nigeria's leadership ambitions on the continent, its desire to be seen as the natural leader of African diplomacy and governance, were being directly challenged by processes Nigeria had helped create. African Union members who had maintained polite silence began speaking differently. South African officials raised due process concerns. Ghanaian diplomats questioned alignment with AU governance principles. The unspoken agreement among African leaders, "Don't criticize each other's internal affairs too harshly," was cracking under the weight of documented evidence that could no longer be ignored. For decades, that agreement had protected a lot of African governments from accountability. But younger democratic movements across the continent were challenging the consensus. Citizens were demanding that their governments stop enabling impunity in the name of solidarity. The Kanu case had become a test of whether African institutions would enforce their own stated principles or continue providing cover for repression under the language of non-interference. Africa was watching, and many people across the continent understood exactly what this moment meant. Inside Nigeria, opposition parties seized the political opening. Emergency legislative sessions were demanded. Lawmakers from southeastern states threatened boycotts. Youth movements that had organized around economic grievances found in Kanu's case a focal point that connected their frustrations about corruption, unemployment, and broken promises to a specific, visible injustice. The street energy that had been building since Tinubu's fuel subsidy removal found new direction. This was no longer just about one prisoner. This was about whether Tinubu's government was capable of anything different from what had come before, whether all the talk of democratic renewal meant anything at all. And here is what made this so explosive for Tinubu personally. He had run for president as someone who understood persecution. He had been forced into exile during military rule. He knew what it meant to be targeted by a government that used courts and security forces as political weapons. He had built his entire public narrative on having survived authoritarianism and committed himself to something better. Now he was defending the system he had once fled from. He was using the same language, the same justifications, the same tactics that had once been used against him. The man who had campaigned on democratic renewal was becoming the face of political detention on the international stage. Critics did not let that irony sit quietly. It spread through social media, through civil society statements, through the commentary of legal scholars and human rights advocates who had once supported his candidacy and now expressed shock at what they were witnessing. The transformation from persecuted dissident to defender of political detention seemed to confirm the darkest view of Nigerian politics, that the system corrupts everyone who enters it, regardless of what they promised before they reached power. 3 weeks after Washington's initial demand, Tinubu convened an emergency cabinet meeting. No agenda was distributed, but everyone understood the purpose. The finance minister presented economic projections that removed any remaining illusion about what continued resistance would cost. The foreign affairs minister described diplomatic isolation that was deepening by the week. The national security advisor warned that the Southeast was reaching a dangerous threshold of radicalization. But the assessment that changed the room came from a retired Supreme Court justice who had quietly reviewed Kanu's case. His conclusion was unambiguous. The detention violated Nigerian law, constitutional protections, and international standards. The rendition from Kenya was illegal. The trial process had been compromised by political interference. The continued detention lacked legal justification. In any court operating without political pressure, the government's position would likely collapse. Tinubu listened without speaking, the weight of the moment visible to everyone in that room. He had inherited a system built for repression, and instead of dismantling it, he had used it until it trapped him. Until the very tactics that previous governments had employed to stay in power became the source of his greatest political crisis. What was said next in that cabinet room eventually leaked to journalists. Tinubu acknowledged that he had underestimated Washington's resolve. He admitted the government's legal position was weak. He recognized that his legacy would be defined by this choice, whether he continued down the path of repression or finally broke from it. But what he actually decided, what instructions he gave, what plan was put in motion, remained undisclosed when the meeting ended. No announcement came. Nigeria held its breath. International observers issued final warnings that patience had limits. Protest movements prepared for either outcome. The entire country stood at the edge of a decision that could reshape its relationship with democracy, with justice, and with itself. And somewhere in a detention facility in Abuja, Nnamdi Kanu waited, as he had waited for years, unaware that his case had become something much larger than one man's imprisonment. It had become a referendum on whether Nigeria could evolve, on whether international pressure could force African governments to choose principle over political survival, on whether Tinubu was the leader he had claimed to be, or simply the latest version of what Nigeria had always produced. Powerful men who spoke of justice loudly until they held power, then quietly built walls around it. Now, what followed that cabinet meeting revealed something even deeper about the nature of power in Nigeria and across Africa, because within days of the meeting, a calculated information war began. Government loyalists flooded Nigerian media with a coordinated narrative. They framed the entire situation as a Western plot to destabilize Africa's largest democracy. They argued that Washington's demand was not about human rights at all. It was about control, about keeping Nigeria dependent, about making sure that Abuja remained answerable to foreign capitals rather than to its own people and its own constitution. And here is the dangerous thing about that argument. It was not entirely wrong. America does not demand prisoner releases out of pure moral concern. Washington has supported dictators across Africa when it served strategic interests. They overlooked abuses in Nigeria for decades when Nigerian oil and regional stability were the priority. Critics across the continent pointed this out loudly. The same United States that once looked away while Nigerian military governments disappeared political opponents was now positioning itself as a human rights champion. The hypocrisy was real, and Tinubu's team knew exactly how to use it. But using Western hypocrisy as a shield for domestic repression is one of the oldest tricks in the authoritarian playbook, and Africa has seen it too many times to be fooled by it again. The argument that foreign pressure invalidates domestic justice is a trap. It tells people that they cannot demand accountability from their own leaders because doing so means siding with external enemies. It turns every legitimate grievance into a foreign conspiracy. It protects governments not by proving their innocence but by making criticism feel like betrayal. Kanu's supporters recognized this tactic immediately. They had seen it before. Every time the Southeast raised questions about marginalization, the response was accusations of separatism and foreign funding. Every time lawyers challenged the legality of the detention, they were framed as agents of destabilization. The pattern was consistent: deflect the substance by attacking the motivation of anyone raising it. But the documented evidence made deflection increasingly difficult, because this was not a case built on speculation. Years of legal filings, court transcripts, diplomatic correspondence, and eyewitness testimony had created a record that could not be dismissed with sovereignty language. The rendition from Kenya happened, the compromise trial proceedings happened, the prolonged detention without resolution happened. These were not opinions. They were documented facts that courts and international bodies were now formally examining, and that documentation was spreading beyond legal circles. Journalists across Nigeria, the United Kingdom, and the United States published detailed investigative pieces that walked ordinary readers through the timeline of violations. Social media translated legal language into simple, shareable content. Young Nigerians who had never followed Kanu's case closely were suddenly reading court documents and diplomatic cables on their phones. The information that governments rely on keeping obscure was becoming common knowledge. That shift in public awareness was perhaps the most dangerous development for Tinubu's position. You can manage elite pressure. You can navigate diplomatic negotiations. You can contain protest movements through security responses. But you cannot easily reverse a moment when ordinary citizens begin to understand a system that was designed to confuse them. Meanwhile, the second prisoner at the center of Washington's demand was drawing attention of his own. His case carried different political dimensions, but the same fundamental pattern: prolonged detention, questionable legal process, and a government unwilling to allow transparent resolution. International human rights organizations documented his situation with the same thoroughness they had applied to Kanu's case, and the combination of the two cases created something more powerful than either one alone. It created a pattern, and patterns are much harder to explain away than individual incidents. Pattern meant policy. Pattern meant design. Pattern meant that what was happening to these two men was not a mistake or an anomaly. It was how the system worked. And the world was now saying that out loud, in formal statements, in legal filings, and in coordinated diplomatic pressure that showed no signs of easing. Tinubu found himself facing a question that no amount of political calculation could fully answer. How do you defend a pattern when the pattern is indefensible? Some of his advisors began pushing for what they called a controlled resolution. a legal pathway that would allow the government to claim it was following due process while quietly moving toward outcomes that would satisfy international partners. The idea was to create enough procedural movement that Washington could declare progress without Abuja having to make an outright admission of wrongdoing. It was the kind of political engineering that Nigerian governments had used before to survive international pressure without actually changing anything fundamental. But Washington had anticipated exactly this kind of maneuver. American officials made clear in private diplomatic communications that cosmetic movement would not be accepted as genuine compliance. They had seen African governments use procedural theater to stall accountability before. They wanted timelines. They wanted verifiable benchmarks. They wanted outcomes that could be independently confirmed. The space for managed ambiguity was narrowing rapidly, and this is where the continental dimension of the story became impossible to separate from the Nigerian one, because across Africa, other governments were watching how this confrontation unfolded. Leaders in countries with their own political detainees, their own compromised courts, their own populations demanding accountability were calculating what Tinubu's response would signal about the costs and consequences of similar positions. If Nigeria, Africa's largest and most powerful nation, was forced to yield to international pressure on a human rights case, it would send a message that reverberated far beyond Abuja. Some African leaders feared that message. They did not want international pressure on political detentions to become normalized. They did not want the precedent that foreign demands could force domestic legal outcomes. Their concern was framed in sovereignty language, but beneath it was something more personal. Their own governments held their own inconvenient prisoners. Their own judicial systems served their own political interests. A Nigeria that yielded under pressure created a standard they might eventually be held to. Others saw something different in this moment. Reformers, civil society leaders, younger political movements across the continent were watching with hope, not because they trusted Washington's motives, but because they understood that accountability sometimes comes through unexpected doors. If international pressure created space for justice in Nigeria, that space mattered regardless of who opened it. This is the tension that defines so much of Africa's political reality right now, the desire for genuine sovereignty clashing with the recognition that internal accountability mechanisms have been so thoroughly corrupted that external pressure sometimes becomes the only force capable of creating movement. It is not a comfortable truth, but it is an honest one. Africa deserves governments that make external pressure unnecessary. Governments that hold themselves accountable to their own people through their own institutions. Governments where courts work, where rights are protected, where political prisoners are not a category that exists in the first place. That Africa is not a fantasy, it is a demand. And the generation making that demand is larger, more connected, and less willing to wait than any generation that came before it. Tinubu's response, whatever form it finally takes, will not resolve that demand. It will only reveal how much pressure is required before leaders who claim to represent African dignity are willing to apply that principle to the people under their own authority. The decision was coming, the world was watching, and the question that had always haunted Nigeria, the question that haunts every African nation where power has been turned against people, was still waiting for an answer. Who does power serve when the people who fought for it finally hold it? Africa has heard the promises. Africa has seen the betrayals. Africa has buried too many of both, but this generation is not burying this moment quietly. They are documenting it, sharing it, building the record that history will use to judge every leader who had the chance to choose differently and chose the same old path instead. Tinubu still had that chance. Whether he would take it, that was the only question that remained, and it was not a small question. It was the question that this entire story had been building toward from the moment Washington said the words that Abuja could no longer ignore. The silence was broken. Now the choice had to be made, and Africa was not looking away.